I've got to think up an intro. What kind of intro could I do? Hear me now, esportspools. Nah, that accent is not quite there. File that one away for now. You, like me, have probably had your issues with polar. Wait. Where's this going? Nah, I've lost my train of thought. Prove you know who'll win at esportspools, or I'll kill. Maybe not on second thoughts. They even have live in-play betting. That accent, I don't want to seem like a hack. If you know who the best players are for fantasy, what kind of a loser would rap in a commercial? Get rich fat? No. I mean, what kind of unethical piece of shit would use, obviously, false advertising like that? You know what? I'm out, guys. I guess it's just going to can't be a commercial for this one. Inferno not just being introduced to the competitive map pool, but more importantly, becoming more and more prevalent, and especially as a key map for some of the elite teams in the world, was a factor which hurt Astralis' performance over this year and played a key role in their downfall from the #1 team to a contender to now a good team, but who hasn't really looked like they were going to win big championships, at least with their main lineup featuring Device, for many, many months now. So let's consider and take stock. Before Inferno was introduced, Astralis was the #1 team in the world. They'd won the Major, they'd won ECS Season 2, they'd been in the final of E-League Season 2, they were on a streak of 3 straight finals. DreamHack Vegas was the first event to use Inferno, and they were the #1 team. In fact, even after Inferno initially came into the pool at Vegas and Katowice, they still remained #1, they won Katowice. They were the best team in the world for overall the first 3 months of the year. Then they became simply contenders for the next 3 months, who certainly were right there with the SKs and FaZe of the world, but just a notch below where they would lose out in the big series against those teams, and hence traditionally, except for a few exceptions, didn't win the tournaments and were close, but those teams did enough to be better than them and indeed win those tournaments and make more finals and overall more top 4s at the time. Then, from the player break onwards, so after the Major, they haven't really been true contenders for the world #1 spot. At times, they might have been ranked #2 or #3, but that was just on the basis of some good top 4s. They had the finals run at ESL E-League Premier, but that was about it, really. They finally had their streak snapped of finishing in the top 4. That was straight away at DreamHack Malmo, and then obviously at ESL New York, they didn't get out of the group stage. So they only played in 1 final from the player break onwards. They had some top 4s. That's pretty good. Then they had the issues with Device that meant they just couldn't even use them for the latter few months of the year. Now, obviously, their drop in form isn't just due to Inferno. There's not just one factor that stops you from being the #1 team, but you have to add it in there. Now, yes, there's Device's health issues. That's certainly been a problem towards the latter end of the year. They haven't been able to use him in many of the tournaments, and he's been somewhat limited at some of those tournaments. He also had a slight drop in form over the year, but generally was still a very good player, still pretty consistent. Maybe just wasn't playing at the top superstar level at all times, and therefore wasn't really in contention to be the MVP after Star Ladder, really. That was about the last time, Star Ladder Season 3 back in April. Every tournament after that, okay, he was good, but he was never really like a top 2 MVP candidate at a tournament. You had Kierby having issues from the summer onwards, especially as an entry fragger. Okay, that's something to put to it. Glaive certainly had his problems fragging, but then again, Glaive fragging was never really a big factor for why they were doing so well in the first place. More importantly, you'd probably also say the rise of the better teams. You obviously had both of the FaZe lineups really got their shit together from this period onwards. The SK Gaming lineups, both of those obviously rose up. So basically 4 different lineups came along that were better than Astralis and certainly better on Inferno. And so the Inferno aspect has to be tied into the better teams coming along. You can somewhat attach it to some of the individual players, but this map particularly was a costly one, and for what it did to Astralis' map pool, but also in the context of who they had to play to potentially win some of these semis, win some of these finals, and therefore get more titles this year than just 2 titles. So over the entire time the rework of Inferno has been out, Astralis is 13 wins and 9 losses on it. So, yeah, not bad. Still a decent enough record. Some good wins there. The problem is when you divide it up into time span, they were 7 and 4. So, pretty good record, actually. over the period from Vegas to ECS, and then from PGL Krakow, the major, afterwards, you're in a scenario where they went 6-5. So the record gets much, much worse. So let's go to the period when they were strong. So when they were 7-4 before PGL Krakow, in the spring, the map wasn't played very often. IM Katowice, out of all the maps played, it was only played just under 14% of the time. Starladder Season 3, it was played a bit more. It was played almost 22% of the time. IM Sydney, it was only played 12% of the time. In general, teams weren't really going with it very often now, even in the group stage, which is interesting because obviously later on it became a much more shared map that people were willing to play in group stages. ECS Season 3, we see it starts to take a peak. It was played 25% of the time out of 24 maps played. And part of the factor as to why it wasn't played as often is, yes, people were learning this rework of the map. People were introducing it back into their pool. And more importantly, because people were introducing it back in, it wasn't a map that a lot of teams hit the ground running on. There was no real clear best team on it. And so, funnily enough, it was only picked in a series by the other team against Astralis once over this initial period. And that was actually by NIP at the first tournament it was at, DreamHack Vegas, in the round of 8, where Astralis won on the map. And obviously early on, as I said, 7-4, Astralis was doing pretty well on it. It was actually only the decider of a series at this point in time once, which was obviously the, if you're an Astralis fan, the infamous Starladder Season 3 final, where FaZe had it as the decider in the final itself. And obviously Astralis was actually at championship point on this map, could have won the tournament. They, in the end, got pushed to overtime, and in overtime, FaZe won the map, won the tournament, and that was the last final Astralis was in for a while until the E-League Premier, and it was the last real chance at a title that Astralis had, because they were obviously like one round from winning a title here, whereas the E-League Premier final wasn't that close overall. And they never were again in position to actually outright win an event because they lost to Gambit in the semis at the other tournaments. And then otherwise it was FaZe and it was SK and these teams beating them out in big semi-finals and proving themselves to be better teams, quite frankly. Funnily enough, over this span of time, Astralis themselves picked the map twice. They picked it as the 4th map of the IM Katowice final when neither team really had massive experience. And it was the first event for FaZe with Nico. FaZe won this one, Astralis won this one. And they picked it against CLG and the round of 8 at Starladder, and they won this one as well. Now you come to the summer, FaZe and SK teams are really fully in power. We're talking about the FaZe lineup when they had Kiyoshima and Alu. We're talking about the SK lineup with Phelps, who were the 2 best teams in the world, were making pretty much every final, were top 4 every single event, both of them. And these 2 teams not only became better teams than Astralis, but a big factor was Inferno, because they were better Inferno teams than Astralis, and this became a key component going on. Then you add in Team Liquid rose up after the player break, and Inferno was by far their best map, and a very strong one that they were consistently winning on against SK, against Astralis. Well, and at certain points in time, you had obviously G2 improved massively after the spring. They were already around in the spring, but they got a lot better from the summer onwards. That's when they had their big peaks and troughs, but their big peaks when they would hit their ceilings. Inferno was a strong map for them. Elsewhere, Gambit embraced the map massively. They were no longer just the team that they were around the spring that was amazing on Cobblestone Novapass. Now they had Inferno as well as a strong map. You had Envy rise up, and that became by far their best map, and the one that they were able to beat the likes of SK on and have a really hot streak on. So you had a lot of the scene start to get established on Inferno, start to get good on Inferno. Meanwhile, Astralis got worse on Inferno. They were only good on it in the period when it was much more of a wide open map. No one really knew how to play it, what the established meta necessarily was, and they were the best team with most of their players in peak form, including Kirby, including Device. But when all these other factors started to come in, now we see them start to lose. And so from PGL Krakow onwards, they lost 18 maps, did Astralis. And this is including maps that they had... I think I only counted the maps where they played with Device here, off the top of my head. And of the 18 maps they lost, the map they lost the most, the 2 were Inferno and Mirage, but they lost Inferno 5 times. They lost both of them 5 times. And so Inferno accounted for almost 28% of the maps lost by Astralis from the major onwards. Now, interestingly enough, of the wins that they had, the 13 wins, they had 10 that I would count as relevant wins. Like, I've removed CLG, Chiefs, Mongols, so they had 10 relevant wins. And of the 10 relevant wins, is over all the year, they only had 2 I would count versus elite teams, which was against FaZe and G2. So 8 of their wins weren't really against the best teams. They were against all right teams, NIP, Fnatic, Team Liquid, Cloud9. So, good and at times better teams, at times good teams rather, but not elite level teams. Now you look at their losses. So they had 9 losses on the map over the year. I would say of the relevant losses that they had, all 9 were relevant, which is an interesting factor. They lost to North, pretty good team at times. They lost to FaZe twice. They lost to SK 3 times. They lost to Team Liquid and they lost to G2 twice. Now, if you're looking at certain points in time at who the best teams were on this map, FaZe and SK would be right up there. G2 was strong on it. Team Liquid was specialists on it towards the end of the year. So actually, generally, they're only losing to the best teams. Like if you count FaZe, SK, and G2 at different times as elite teams, of the 9 losses, 7 times were to elite teams. So one of the problems for Astralis is Astralis are a good Inferno team and were at all points during the year. But from the summer onwards, they were losing to the best Inferno teams and to the elite teams in general. And therefore, Inferno was the factor that was helping shift the map pool to those teams. And basically, most of the big Inferno games were key losses for Astralis versus very good Inferno teams. And we can see how important that is in that sense. So you think of the PGL period onwards, where they were 6 and 5, they were losing mainly, yes, to SK, FaZe, Team Liquid, very good Inferno teams. And you look also now at the pattern of it getting picked against Astralis and it being the decider. Now, it wasn't actually picked against them that often because often teams would have a different map they preferred to play. So Gambit actually picked it against them at PGL Krakow, and actually Astralis won this map. In fact, quite heavily. Team Liquid picked it against them twice. ESL New York, this was one Astralis lost, and the Team Liquid guys managed to win that series and eliminate them before the playoffs for the first time in a tournament. Then you had Team Liquid pick it at Epicenter, but actually Astralis won that one. Now, it wasn't significant people picking it against them, but as a decider, it became a massive factor for Astralis because it was the decider against them this year let me see, 6 different key occasions. So at Star Ladder, in the final, it was the decider. They lost that one very narrowly. At ECS, it was twice a decider. In the group, let me think, that can't be right. It can't be right in the group because they couldn't have played Team Liquid there. No, I'm thinking of a different map there. It was the decider against SK, rather, in the semi-finals of ECS Season 3. They lost that one very narrowly. It was a map they played as the decider against Cloud9 at E-League Premier. They actually won that one fairly heavily, actually. In the final against FaZe, it would have been the decider, but they didn't even get to play it because FaZe beat them on cash and then actually beat them on overpass as well, so that one was done. And then in the third place decider against G2, it was the deciding map there, and G2 won that map. So of these scenarios, most of them losses for Astralis. So consider this. If they had a different map, or if they don't lose to FaZe, then they win Star Ladder. If they don't lose this decider map to SK in narrow fashion, they're in the final of ECS Season 3. If they don't lose to G2, then they're third place at Epicenter. We see how a number of their placings hinged on a decider on Inferno. Now, the issues for them on Inferno. Let's start at the top. When your best player is Device, a very all-around player, you have to look at how he plays. Now, obviously, earlier in the year when they were playing the likes of Overpass, Train, these are fantastic maps for Device on the CT side. He is still a good player on the CT side of Inferno and Mirage, but on Inferno, first of all, this is a map that really stressed the fact that he was a lone AWPer, because he tried to be mobile. Sometimes they would switch him up CT-wise, but because in defending that B site is so important, because an AWPer often defends that site, and because you often want to place the AWPer in the banana to allow your rotator to come back over to the A site, he often was stuck on the B site. So even though he actually had pretty good ratings, pretty good results on the map, pretty good stats, objectively, qualitatively, when he watched the games, seems to play pretty well. First of all, he's not having the same superstar impact he can on maps like Mirage, Overpass, Train. He's just a good player, and also he's more predictable on this map on the CT side, and CT side was where the big issues for Astralis generally came up stylistically. So then you consider that they didn't actually switch him up as much for the reasons I said you can't really, and how the meta developed from the summer onwards. Then you have Kirby. Kirby actually on this map was absolute feast or famine. He either went completely ham and was amazing and they won the map, or he was really terrible, barely got any kills and was a non-factor. Then you go over to Glaive. Over the year, his fragging really went downhill, and he had a lot of bad games on Inferno until the last couple of months of this year. In fact, the period when they didn't have device most of the time. He was a really, really sore spot on this map, on both sides, quite frankly. But the main reason stylistically as to why Astralis struggled on this map is their CT defense was quite poor. It was really rather weak. There was still a good T-side team, so they could get in a lot of these games, but all you have to do is look at this. So from ECS onwards, they lost the CT side in every single one of their losses on Inferno. CT side is what cost them the chance to win. Even in their wins from ECS onwards, they lost CT side I got it wrong around there. In their wins on Inferno from that same period of time, 6 out of 8 times, they won the CT side. So winning or losing the CT side just outright cost Astralis the map the majority of the time. Only 2 times did they ever lose CT side and still win the game with a monster T side that could take over the game. And obviously, you look at the way that they played, they were not a team that was very good on this map without full utility. They couldn't just play their spots like they could on a map like Overpass or Train, where they could sometimes play with less utility, but play off each other fantastically, and they're not having as much impact from device. Kirby's up and down massively, and often having his impact on the T side. Glaive was a liability. Then you look, they're having so many close games on the map, they're having to live and die also on the clutches. Zipnik's device have got to pull off amazing clutches just to give them chances on the CT side when you see how they play on this map. So generally, stylistically, a very poor map for them. Now, the reason why this is significant is because if you contrast this with the map that Inferno rework replaced, Dust 2, people will forget this. When Astralis rose up in the latter part of last year, I think it was around October, right, that they got Glaive, they were playing in a map pool where we didn't have Inferno. We had Dust 2, the old version of Dust 2. And on this map, they played it 5 times offline with Glaive in the lineup and Device and the full team that you think of now. And they played it 5 times. They won 4 of the 5 times. So the one loss they had was against SK Gaming with Fox at the Major in, I think it's a Swiss system, right? And it was an epic overtime loss that they were in a very good position for. So generally, you look at Dust 2, and they were a pretty good Dust 2. They were one of the best Dust 2 teams. It was right up there in their map pool. So yes, we know they had Overpass, Train. They also had Dust 2. So they had these 3 really strong maps. One more of a skill map that you can just play off free-form play. The other 2 more the tactical maps and the ones that you need the really, really disciplined T side in order to win on and therefore fit the strengths of Astralis. So in a world where Dust 2 was there instead of Inferno, now yes, SK with Phelps should have been a very strong team on Dust 2. FaZe with any of their lineups would have been monsters on Dust 2. But you have to figure that Inferno actually cost them more, whereas Dust 2 would at least have evened the odds somewhat. They were a very good team on Dust 2. They also showcased a really good ability to play off Device the whole year. So if you give Device full mobility on T side and CT side as an AWPer, you can have massive impact there. If you give Glaive the opportunity on more of a set map, where people are used to simple plays, to call those mid-round calls. He would often sit around the double doors and he would either call splits to B, or that's how he would call the fast attack onto A. If you give him the opportunity to do those very fast reactive mid-rounds, which are tougher to set up on Inferno, then you're also going to be getting more T rounds. CT side plays itself out more by the numbers, and you're able to play off individual skill there. Seems like Dust 2 would have been better for them, not least because of what it would have done to their map pool. They'd have had 3 very strong maps. They've had Overpass, Train, Dust 2. Now if you take away their Overpass or their Train, they can go with a Dust 2 or one of the other ones. Now they're going to get some Dust 2s as the third map more often. A lot of teams, except SK and FaZe, weren't really feeling that map as often. And with this map in the equation and no Inferno, you're either going to get more Dust 2 third maps between these teams or more Mirage third maps. That's an interesting factor to consider right there. Also, when they've got those as their 3 strong maps, they've still got some pretty playable maps. They've got Nuke, Cache, Mirage. We know they can play those, just depends on the opponent, and we know they don't play Cobblestone. So I think not only was Inferno a map which cost Astralis and really started their spiral down, especially because they were losing it to all the elite teams on that, all the very good teams, the specialists, but also because it took out Dust 2, which was a good map for them, and which the potential on was much bigger, it seems, but we only got to see them play it 5 times.
I'm Device from Astralis, and welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel. It's a choke-free zone.